Good afternoon, students. I am Professor Sumita Parmar. I am the principal investigator for the subject of Women's Studies, and today I will be presenting to you Module 17 of Paper 8. Paper 8 is on women and health. This module is on women's health in disasters and conflicts. It has been written by Dr. Sana Contractor from the Center for Health and Social Justice, New Delhi. Conflicts and disasters. Human conflicts causing death and suffering and damage to properties can be broadly characterized under the following headings. Armed conflict. This generally refers to war and involves other countries. Insurgency takes place within the country when there is unrest in certain regions, for example, Kashmir, parts of the Northeast, or when there was a demand for a separate Gorkha land. Counterinsurgency is when the government and the insurgency forces clash. Communal, ethnic strife, riots are all civil conflicts occurring within the country. Pogroms are when specific communities are targeted with the intention of destruction. The most famous example is what happened to the Jews during the time of Hitler in Germany, when thousands and thousands of Jews were killed. Natural disasters. There are natural disasters also that cause human death, destruction and suffering. The difference between natural disasters and human conflicts is that natural disasters do not discriminate between the genders but affect everyone, men and women both. However, as we shall see later, women do get affected in somewhat different ways from men, even in natural disasters. Earthquakes, landslides, floods, cyclones, wildfires are some natural disasters that affect India. Cyclones. The cyclones that occur between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn are known as tropical cyclones. In tropical cyclones, winds blow at or more than 62 kilometers per hour. The Indian subcontinent is the worst affected region of the world by cyclones, having a coastline of 7,516 kilometers. Out of this, 5,400 kilometers along the mainland, 132 kilometers in Lakshadweep, and 1900 kilometers in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And it is exposed to nearly 10% of the world's tropical cyclones. Although cyclones affect the entire coast of India, the east coast is more prone compared to the west coast. Analyzed data for the period 1980 to 2000 shows that on an average, annually, 370 million people are exposed to cyclones in India and account for large number of deaths, loss of livelihood opportunities, loss of public and private property, and severe damage to infrastructure. An estimated 32 crore people, which is almost a third of the country's total population, are vulnerable to cyclone-related hazards. Wildfires. The India State of Forest Report, the ISFR 2015, published by the Forest Survey of India, claimed that as much as 64.29% of the recorded forest area is prone to fires. Shockingly, forest fires in India increased by 125% in the last 2 years, and 23 out of 33 states and union territories of the country reported an increase in forest fires. In Punjab, such incidents of fire increased sevenfold, followed by Haryana and Rajasthan, which saw 4 and 3 times a jump in numbers. In 2017, the maximum number of forest fires were reported in Madhya Pradesh, followed by Odisha and Chhattisgarh. So, the natural disasters that affect India the most, cyclones and wildfires, are covered by earthquakes, landslides and floods. In the past few years, India has been ravaged by both earthquakes and floods, and during the monsoons, landslides have been occurring regularly in the hilly regions. The floods have been particularly fierce, causing large-scale loss of life and damage to agriculture and property. In fact, the nation is even now trying to cope with the consequences of the Kerala floods. After the famous tsunami floods, there were reports of the deaths of women because they could not swim due to the saris they were wearing. While trying to save themselves, the saris would get caught between their legs and they would be unable to swim. There were also instances of many women who refused to abandon their children and their old parents and perished along with them. The impact on women rooted in gender roles and pre-existing inequalities. Whatever the nature of the disaster, whether natural or man-made, women are victims of great atrocities and injustices in times of conflict and disasters, and the rape of women is a common phenomenon. As refugees, displaced persons, heads of single households, women and men experience conflict differently. Displaced, isolated, abandoned women and girls are abducted, trafficked, sold and abused. They face sexual violence and rape, sexual mutilation, forced impregnation and abortions. Let's examine some of the differences in how conflict and disasters impact men and women. Men in conflict, disasters and emergencies. First of all, men are more likely to experience great physical trauma and severe emotional trauma as a result of armed conflict. Sometimes, certain sections of male populations, because of their ethnicity or religion or some other factors, may be discriminated against and may miss out on necessary services and provisions. When men travel away from their homes without the support of their families and communities, they often become independent, responsible for their own cooking and cleaning. On the other hand, some of the advantages that men usually have are that men have more freedom to travel and they have more access to information about an emergency that might happen or an emergency situation due to their mobility, their better language skills and their access to radio and television. Men are usually put in charge of decisions about how and when services will be provided. Women, on the other hand, in conflicts, disasters and emergencies, have the advantage in that they are usually the primary group to receive emergency food and services. But the disadvantages are that women are more likely to rely on information by word of mouth due to lack of literacy, limited access to TV and radio, and the inability to travel outside the community. This leads to the risk that they will be exposed to distorted messages about an emergency. The information could also be exaggerated or even incorrect. Women are likely to experience trauma because of lack of security and sexual and physical violence. Although women are generally responsible for feeding and caring of family members, they have little say in the planning of emergency or disaster preparedness programs. When husbands and sons are missing or injured, and women are forced to take on men's work, they lose the protection that men can provide. This also results in an increase of women-headed households. Women are restricted in their ability to travel because of children, social restrictions on their movements, fear of abuse, and lack of transportation. Consequently, the increase in employment opportunities that can arise in a disaster phase are less accessible to women due to family demands or cultural limitations. Now, what is the impact of health of women during times of disaster? Direct impacts. There is, of course, loss of life, there is extreme trauma, and there is the associated sexual violence. Usually, the focus of response to disasters and conflict has been on trauma care, provision of basic facilities like water and shelter, and basic health services. However, in the 1990s, as I just mentioned earlier also, two major declarations at the International Conference on Population and Development, the ICPD, in Cairo in 1994, and the International Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, recognized the specific vulnerability of women in conflict and disasters and called for specific measures to be taken to address these. Since the recognition of the distinct impact of wars and disasters on women in ICPD 1994 and Beijing Platform 1995, there have been several international documents that provide direction on how the health needs of women should be addressed in matters of disasters and conflicts. In recent years, there has been extensive documentation of these, especially that on reproductive health. Sexual violence in conflict. Sexual violence against women in war is frequently systematic. It is not just incidental or random. And with the increase in conflict all over the globe, the sources of violence that women experience cut across a very wide range. So, violence is experienced at the hands of government personnel, parallel non-state armed groups like rebel forces and dissidents, paramilitary and security forces, community members, humanitarian workers, and even from the peacekeeping forces that are sent to protect and provide and restore order. And where are the places, which are the sites that are used to perpetuate violence upon women? And these can be supposedly safe sites like homes and other sites like fields where women work, detention centers where they go for refuge, refugee camps where they expect protection, and medical centers. Women are humiliated and dishonored as the other in some forms of ethnic cleansing. What happens in times of disasters on health systems? First of all, there is a destruction of the infrastructure. So the medium through which help is provided, that in itself is demolished. Then there is a loss of life, and there is a targeting of human resources by the enemy, and obstruction in transport of supplies and of medicines. This impaired accessibility to health facilities also leads to fear and insecurity. The obstruction of mobility due to lack of transportation, due to the imposition of curfews, leads to further insecurity, and the unavailability of medical services themselves due to disasters. There are also some social consequences when there are disasters and war that impact on women. And one of the first among these is early marriages. Parents want to get their daughters married soon so that the responsibility of looking after them becomes somebody else's. Girls and women who are in any case confined, their mobility is curtailed even further. And at the same time, running parallel to this is the reinforcement of masculinities that connect to notions of honor and of courage. Here is an account that I will read to you on the situation in Kashmir described by Khande in the year 2005. Over the years of conflict, women had to face many restrictions from both the family and society. The threat of sexual harassment, abduction, and rape was ever present. They had to bear the cross of family honor, resulting in many hardships. Women were not allowed to move out of the house alone. They had to conform to strict social etiquette. They weren't allowed to pursue education beyond a point, or even to consult a gynecologist. Parents would arrange their marriages as soon as possible. Along with these social restrictions came the dicta of the fundamentalists, banning family planning services. Women were left with no choice but to depend on local doctors and illegal abortion centers, or fall back on traditional systems of medicine. As religious beliefs became stronger, women started depending more on seers than in the past. Here is another account given by Audrey Macklin, who describes the situation in southern Sudan in the year 2008. Men worry about being killed by the government of Sudan or its allies, whether as civilians or as combatants in rebel forces. Women worry that they and their children will be abducted and enslaved by government sponsored militia if they are not killed outright. They also dread the moment when their boy children will be turned into child soldiers to fight in rebel armies against the government of Sudan. Women fear rape by militia, rape by men who distribute aid in exchange for sex, and rape by husbands who demand that they replace dying children by producing still more children who will grow up to wage the national struggle. That is, if the women survive their pregnancies and the children reach adolescence. Maternal health. Maternal health is deeply impacted by war and conflict. High maternal mortality is related to vulnerability caused by displacement and the lack of access to medical care. There is plenty of evidence that indicates the increase of high perinatal mortality, stillbirths, birth abnormalities, and spontaneous abortions during these times. Besides poor access to emergency care, lack of skilled personnel, social factors like early marriage also affect maternal health. Unsafe abortions account for 22 to 25% of maternal deaths in disaster situations. Fertility and family planning. Fertility is known to both increase and decrease in post-conflict and post-disaster situations. Why does fertility increase? Increase in fertility may be attributed to the need to replace lost children or lack of access to contraceptives due to displacement. And decreased fertility may be due to stress of displacement, and in some situation where contraceptive use was not high to begin with, the provisions of such services and camps in host countries may reduce births. RTIs and STIs. Increased prevalence and spread of RTIs, which is reproductive tract infections, and STIs, sexually transmitted infections. These may be a result of 1. Sexual violence, of trafficking, of commercial sex work, the prospect of making money by exploiting the helplessness and the vulnerability of others is unfortunately a common human characteristic. And making money from the bodies of women in war is as old as human civilization. Poor hygiene conditions in camps, often the deplorable and unsanitary conditions in refugee camps, account for the increase in RTIs and STIs. Social conditioning, shame, and concepts of family honor often prevent women from seeking medical help, sometimes even when it is accessible. Mental health is another area which is very highly impacted by war and disaster. War, conflict, and disasters subject populations to high levels of stress due to loss of life, livelihood, sense of insecurity, and uncertainty about the future. This is bound to have an impact on their mental health, which has been documented extensively in literature. In the Indian context, there are fairly limited studies on the impact of conflict and disasters on mental health. One study conducted after the tsunami recorded high levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, commonly known as PTSD, among victims of the disaster. It is significant to note that the study found that the odds of having PTSD were much higher for women as compared to men. Thus, we can see that the relationship between disasters, war, and mental health is documented and established. There is a high exposure to traumatic events, including sexual violence, and not only PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but various kinds of psychological distress, suicide and suicide attempts, major depressive disorders, all form a part of the results of the exposure to war and disasters. In addition to all of the above, a woman's situation is complicated by the added dimension of sexual violence. Studies have extensively documented the impact of sexual violence in conflict on women's mental health. For instance, one study from Liberia found that men and women combatants who experienced sexual violence had a higher prevalence of PTSD, suicidal tendencies, and depression. Another study conducted in 2010 found a higher prevalence of major depressive disorders, suicide attempts, and PTSD among both men and women who had experienced sexual violence. Recognizing this impact, guidelines too have been given for providing psychological support services to men and women in armed conflict. So students, this module has given you a brief account of how and in what ways women are impacted by conflict and disasters, and what are the direct consequences on their health. As you will read more, you will begin to understand the complexities of the issues involved and see how these problems are being addressed. Thank you.